Most people know the baby boomers. Most people know Generation X. And today, everyone talks about millennials and Gen Z. But there's an entire group of people who lived through the same history, yet somehow almost disappeared from the conversation. They were born roughly between 1954 and 1965, old enough to remember the optimism of the post-war world, young enough to be shaped by the chaos that followed. Psychologists sometimes call them Generation Jones. And if you look closely, their psychology reveals something fascinating. Because they grew up believing in one version of the future, and then had to build their lives in a completely different one. To understand Generation Jones, you have to imagine the atmosphere of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The world, especially in the United States and many Western countries, was full of promise. Television commercials showed smiling families in suburban homes. Schools told children that if they worked hard, they could expect stable careers and comfortable lives. Parents repeated the same message over and over. Study hard, follow the rules. The future will take care of itself. For children growing up during this time, the message felt almost unquestionable. Life seemed predictable. The system seemed reliable. The path forward seemed clear. But by the time Generation Jones reached their teenage years and early adulthood, something had changed. The cultural optimism they grew up with began to crack. Economic instability appeared. Trust in institutions started to weaken. Political scandals shook confidence in leadership. Suddenly, the world felt less predictable than the one they had been promised. And psychologically, this shift had a powerful effect. Because the expectations people absorb during childhood become the blueprint they use to understand adulthood. Generation Jones was raised with a psychological contract. Work hard and stability will follow. But when they stepped into adult life, that contract started to feel uncertain. Not completely broken, but unreliable. And that experience created something psychologists often describe as expectation dissonance. The feeling that the world isn't quite behaving the way you were taught it would. Imagine studying for years believing that effort guarantees reward, then watching people work hard and still struggle. Watching companies lay off loyal employees. Watching systems change faster than anyone predicted. When the world contradicts the rules you learned growing up, the mind adapts in interesting ways. For Generation Jones, one of those adaptations was something we might call practical realism. They didn't fully abandon optimism, but they stopped trusting it blindly. Instead, they developed a mindset built on caution. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. This mindset shaped many of the decisions they made as adults. Take their relationship with work. For many members of Generation Jones, career success became more than ambition. It became a form of security, a way to protect themselves against uncertainty. They worked hard not only to succeed, but to create stability in a world that no longer guaranteed it. You can see this in the way many of them approached their professions. Steady commitment, long hours, reliability, not necessarily flashy ambition, but consistent effort. Because from their perspective, success wasn't just about achievement, it was about safety. There's another psychological layer that shaped Generation Jones, and it comes from their unique position in history. They grew up in an analog world, yet spent most of their careers adapting to a digital one. They learned to write letters, to type on typewriters, to manage physical documents and face-to-face communication. But as they entered the peak of their professional lives, computers began to transform workplaces. Suddenly, the skills that defined their early careers were evolving. New systems appeared, new technologies demanded attention, and they had to learn them quickly. This experience forced Generation Jones into a role many people never notice. They became translators between eras. Older colleagues sometimes struggled with new technology. Younger colleagues grew up with it. But Generation Jones had experience with both. They understood the discipline and structure of the old systems, and they adapted to the flexibility of the new ones. This ability made them incredibly valuable in workplaces. But psychologically, it also created a subtle tension. Because living between two worlds can feel strangely disorienting. To older generations, they sometimes seemed too modern. To younger generations, they sometimes seemed tied to older habits. They belonged to both environments, but fully to neither. This in-between identity can shape how people see themselves. They become adaptable, but they also become quietly vigilant, constantly adjusting, constantly bridging gaps between different perspectives. You can also see this psychological pattern in the way Generation Jones approached family life. Many of them became parents during a time of rapid social change. They wanted their children to have more opportunities than they had experienced, so they encouraged ambition, education, personal development. But at the same time, their own experiences had taught them something important. Nothing is guaranteed. So along with encouragement came subtle pressure. Study hard, stay competitive, be prepared. In many ways, they were trying to protect their children from the instability they had encountered. But this protection sometimes created a complicated emotional environment. Children heard two messages at once. You can become anything, but you must also be careful. That mixture of optimism and caution reflects the psychology of Generation Jones perfectly. Hope combined with realism, ambition balanced by vigilance. And then something interesting happens as members of Generation Jones move into later stages of life. They begin asking a different question. After decades of work, adaptation, and responsibility, many start wondering, was it worth it? Did all the effort finally deliver the stability we were promised? Or did we simply spend our lives adjusting to constant change? This reflection isn't necessarily negative. In fact, it often brings a deeper perspective. Because Generation Jones has witnessed something few generations experience in the same way, the collapse of one social promise and the creation of another. They saw a world that believed stability was guaranteed, and they helped build the world that replaced it. The digital economy, the fast-changing workforce, the flexible structures younger generations now navigate every day. In other words, they were the generation that quietly carried society through a transition. And transitions rarely receive recognition. Bridges rarely get attention. People simply walk across them. That's the strange psychological reality of Generation Jones. They were never absent from history. They were simply standing in the middle of it, helping one era connect to the next. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden in their story. Every generation imagines the world it will inherit, but sometimes the most important role a generation plays is adapting to the world that actually appears. Generation Jones didn't just grow up in a time of change. They became experts at living through it, and in a future that will almost certainly continue changing faster than anyone expects, that might turn out to be one of the most valuable psychological skills of all.